Chapter 17, Part 1 of Sentimental Education. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Sentimental Education by Gustave Flaubert. Chapter 17. A Strange Betrothal. Part 1. Monsieur d'Ambreuse, when Deslauriers presented himself at his house, was thinking of reviving his great coal mining speculation. But this fusion of all the companies into one was looked upon unfavourably. There was an outcry against monopolies, as if immense capital were not needed for carrying out enterprises of this kind. Deslauriers, who had read for the purpose the work of Jobet and the articles of Monsieur Chappe in the Journal des Mines, understood the question perfectly. He demonstrated that the law of 1810 established for the benefit of the grantee a privilege which could not be transferred. Besides, a democratic colour might be given to the undertaking. To interfere with the formation of coal mining companies was against the principle even of association. Monsieur d'Ambreuse entrusted to him some notes for the purpose of drawing up a memorandum. As for the way in which he meant to pay for the work, he was all the more profuse in his promises from the fact that they were not very definite. Deslauriers called again at Frédéric's house and gave him an account of the interview. Moreover, he had caught a glimpse of Madame d'Ambreuse at the bottom of the stairs, just as he was going out. "I wish you joy, upon my soul I do." Then they had a chat about the election. There was something to be devised in order to carry it. 3 days later, Deslauriers reappeared with a sheet of paper covered with handwriting intended for the newspapers, and which was nothing less than a friendly letter from Monsieur d'Ambreuse expressing approval of their friend's candidature. Supported by a Conservative and praised by a Red, he ought to succeed. How was it that the capitalist had put his signature to such a lucubration? The advocate had of his own motion, and without the least appearance of embarrassment, gone and shown it to Madame d'Ambreuse, who, thinking it quite appropriate, had taken the rest of the business on her own shoulders. Frédéric was astonished at this proceeding. Nevertheless, he approved of it. Then, as Deslauriers was to have an interview with Monsieur Roch, his friend explained to him how he stood with regard to Louise. "Tell them anything you like, that my affairs are in an unsettled state, that I am putting them in order. She is young enough to wait." Deslauriers set forth, and Frédéric looked upon himself as a very able man. He experienced, moreover, a feeling of gratification, a profound satisfaction. His delight at being the possessor of a rich woman was not spoiled by any contrast. The sentiment harmonized with the surroundings. His life now would be full of joy in every sense. Perhaps the most delicious sensation of all was to gaze at Madame d'Ambreuse in the midst of a number of other ladies in her drawing-room. The propriety of her manners made him dream of other attitudes. While she was talking in a tone of coldness, he would recall to mind the loving words which she had murmured in his ear. All the respect which he felt for her virtue gave him a thrill of pleasure, as if it were an homage which was reflected back on himself, and at times he felt a longing to exclaim, "But I know her better than you. She is mine." It was not long ere their relations came to be socially recognized as an established fact. Madame d'Ambreuse, during the whole winter, brought Frédéric with her into fashionable society. He nearly always arrived before her, and he watched her as she entered the house they were visiting with her arms uncovered, a fan in her hand, and pearls in her hair. She would pause on the threshold. The lintel of the door formed a framework round her head, and she would open and shut her eyes with a certain air of indecision in order to see whether he was there. She drove him back in her carriage. The rain lashed the carriage blinds. The passers-by seemed merely shadows wavering in the mire of the street, and, pressed close to each other, they observed all these things vaguely, with a calm disdain. Under various pretexts, he would linger in her room for an entire additional hour. It was chiefly through a feeling of ennui that Madame d'Ambreuse had yielded. But this latest experience was not to be wasted. She desired to give herself up to an absorbing passion, and so she began to heap on his head adulations and caresses. She sent him flowers. She had an upholstered chair made for him. She made presents to him of a cigar holder, an inkstand, 1,000 little things for daily use, so that every act of his life should recall her to his memory. These kind attentions charmed him at first, and in a little while appeared to him very simple. She would step into a cab, get rid of it at the opening into a byway, and come out at the other end, and then, gliding along by the walls, with a double veil on her face, she would reach the street where Frederick, who had been keeping watch, would take her arm quickly to lead her towards his house. His 2 men-servants would have gone out for a walk, and the doorkeeper would have been sent on some errand. She would throw a glance around her, nothing to fear, and she would breathe forth the sigh of an exile who beholds his country once more. Their good fortune emboldened them. Their appointments became more frequent. One evening she even presented herself, all of a sudden, in full ball dress. These surprises might have perilous consequences. He reproached her for her lack of prudence. Nevertheless, he was not taken with her appearance. The low body of her dress exposed her thinness too freely. It was then that he discovered what had hitherto been hidden from him: the disillusion of his senses. None the less did he make professions of ardent love. But in order to call up such emotions, he found it necessary to evoke the images of Rosinette and Madame Arnoux. This sentimental atrophy left his intellect entirely untrammeled, and he was more ambitious than ever of attaining a high position in society. Inasmuch as he had such a stepping stone, the very least he could do was to make use of it. One morning, about the middle of January, Senecal entered his study and, in response to his exclamation of astonishment, announced that he was Deslauriers's secretary. He even brought Frederick a letter. It contained good news, and yet it took him to task for his negligence. He would have to come down to the scene of action at once. The future deputy said he would set out on his way there in 2 days' time. Senecal gave no opinion on the other's merits as a candidate. He spoke about his own concerns and about the affairs of the country. Miserable as the state of things happened to be, it gave him pleasure, for they were advancing in the direction of communism. In the first place, the administration led towards it of its own accord, since every day a greater number of things were controlled by the government. As for property, the constitution of '48, in spite of its weakness, had not spared it. The state might, in the name of public utility, henceforth take whatever it thought would suit it. Senecal declared himself in favour of authority. And Frederick noticed in his remarks the exaggeration which characterized what he had said himself to Deslauriers. The Republican even inveighed against the masses for their inadequacy. Robespierre, by upholding the right of the minority, had brought Louis XVI to acknowledge the National Convention and saved the people. Things were rendered legitimate by the end towards which they were directed. A dictatorship is sometimes indispensable. Long live tyranny, provided that the tyrant promotes the public welfare. Their discussion lasted a long time, and, as he was taking his departure, Senecal confessed, perhaps it was the real object of his visit, that Deslauriers was getting very impatient at Monsieur d'Ambreuse's silence. But Monsieur d'Ambreuse was ill. Frederick saw him every day, his character of an intimate friend enabling him to obtain admission to the invalid's bedside. General Changarnier's recall had powerfully affected the capitalist's mind. He was, on the evening of the occurrence, seized with a burning sensation in his chest, together with an oppression that prevented him from lying down. The application of leeches gave him immediate relief. The dry cough disappeared. The respiration became more easy, and 8 days later he said, while swallowing some broth, "Ah, I'm better now. But I was near going on the last long journey." "Not without me!" exclaimed Madame d'Ambreuse, intending by this remark to convey that she would not be able to outlive him. Instead of replying, he cast upon her and upon her lover a singular smile, in which there was at the same time resignation, indulgence, irony, and even, as it were, a touch of humour, a sort of secret satisfaction almost amounting to actual joy. Frederick wished to start for Nogent. Madame d'Ambreuse objected to this, and he unpacked and repacked his luggage by turns according to the changes in the invalid's condition. Suddenly, Monsieur d'Ambreuse spat forth considerable blood. The princes of medical science, on being consulted, could not think of any fresh remedy. His legs swelled, and his weakness increased. He had several times evinced a desire to see Cécile, who was at the other end of France with her husband, now a collector of taxes, a position to which he had been appointed a month ago. Monsieur d'Ambreuse gave express orders to send for her. Madame d'Ambreuse wrote 3 letters, which she showed him. Without trusting him even to the care of the nun, she did not leave him for 1 second, and no longer went to bed. The ladies who had their names entered at the door lodge made inquiries about her with feelings of admiration, and the passers-by were filled with respect on seeing the quantity of straw which was placed in the street under the windows. On the 12th of February, at 5 o'clock, a frightful hemoptysis came on. The doctor who had charge of him pointed out that the case had assumed a dangerous aspect. They sent in hot haste for a priest. While Monsieur d'Ambreuse was making his confession, Madame kept gazing curiously at him some distance away. After this, the young doctor applied a blister and awaited the result. The flame of the lamps, obscured by some of the furniture, lighted up the apartment in an irregular fashion. Frederick and Madame d'Ambreuse, at the foot of the bed, watched the dying man. In the recess of a window, the priest and the doctor chatted in low tones. The good sister on her knees kept mumbling prayers. At last came a rattling in the throat. The hands grew cold. The face began to turn white. Now and then he drew a deep breath all of a sudden, but gradually this became rarer and rarer. 2 or 3 confused words escaped him. He turned his eyes upward, and at the same moment his respiration became so feeble that it was almost imperceptible. Then his head sank on one side of the pillow. For a minute, all present remained motionless. Madame d'Ambreuse advanced towards the dead body of her husband, and, without an effort, with the unaffectedness of one discharging a duty, she drew down the eyelids. Then she spread out her 2 arms, her figure writhing as if in a spasm of repressed despair, and quitted the room, supported by the physician and the nun. A quarter of an hour afterwards, Frederick made his way up to her apartment. There was in it an indefinable odour, emanating from some delicate substances with which it was filled. In the middle of the bed lay a black dress, which formed a glaring contrast with the pink coverlet. Madame d'Ambreuse was standing at the corner of the mantelpiece. Without attributing to her any passionate regret, he thought she looked a little sad, and in a mournful voice he said, "You are enduring pain?" "I? No, not at all." As she turned around, her eyes fell on the dress which she inspected. Then she told him not to stand on ceremony. "Smoke, if you like. You can make yourself at home with me. and with a great sigh, "Ah, blessed Virgin, what a riddance." Frederick was astonished at this exclamation. He replied as he kissed her hand, "All the same, you were free." This allusion to the facility with which the intrigue between them had been carried on hurt Madame d'Ambreuse. "Ah, you don't know the services that I did for him, or the misery in which I lived." "What? Why, certainly. Was it a safe thing to have always near him that bastard, a daughter, whom he introduced into the house at the end of 5 years of married life, and who, were it not for me, might have led him into some act of folly?" Then she explained how her affairs stood. The arrangement on the occasion of her marriage was that the property of each party should be separate. The amount of her inheritance was 300,000 francs. Monsieur d'Ambreuse had guaranteed by the marriage contract that, in the event of her surviving him, she should have an income of 15,000 francs a year, together with the ownership of the mansion. But, a short time afterwards, he had made a will by which he gave her all he possessed, and this she estimated, so far as it was possible to ascertain just at present, at over 3 millions. Frederick opened his eyes widely. "It was worth the trouble, wasn't it? However, I contributed to it. It was my own property I was protecting. Cecile would have unjustly robbed me of it." Why did she not come to see her father? As he asked her this question, Madame d'Ambreuse eyed him attentively. Then, in a dry tone, "I haven't the least idea. Want of heart, probably. Oh, I know what she is. And for that reason she won't get a farthing from me." She had not been very troublesome, he pointed out, at any rate since her marriage. "Ha! Her marriage," said Madame d'Ambreuse with a sneer. And she grudged having treated only too well this stupid creature, who was jealous, self-interested, and hypocritical. All the faults of her father. She disparaged him more and more. There was never a person with such profound duplicity, and with such a merciless disposition into the bargain. As hard as a stone. A bad man. A bad man. Even the wisest people fall into errors. Madame d'Ambreuse had just made a serious one through this overflow of hatred on her part. Frederick, sitting opposite her in an easy-chair, was reflecting deeply, scandalized by the language she had used. She arose and knelt down beside him. "To be with you is the only real pleasure. You are the only one I love." While she gazed at him, her heart softened. A nervous reaction brought tears into her eyes, and she murmured, "Will you marry me?" At first he thought he had not understood what she meant. He was stunned by this wealth. She repeated in a louder tone, "Will you marry me?" At last he said with a smile, "Have you any doubt about it?" Then the thought forced itself on his mind that his conduct was infamous, and in order to make a kind of reparation to the dead man, he offered to watch by his side himself. But, feeling ashamed of this pious sentiment, he added in a flippant tone, "It would be perhaps more seemly." "Perhaps so, indeed," she said, "on account of the servants." The bed had been drawn completely out of the alcove. The nun was near the foot of it, and at the head of it sat a priest, a different one, a tall, spare man, with the look of a fanatical Spaniard. On the night table, covered with a white cloth, 3 wax tapers were burning. Frederick took a chair and gazed at the corpse. The face was as yellow as straw. At the corners of the mouth there were traces of blood-stained foam. A silk handkerchief was tied around the skull, and, on the breast, covered with a knitted waistcoat, lay a silver crucifix between the 2 crossed hands. It was over, this life full of anxieties. How many journeys had he not made to various places? How many rows of figures had he not piled together? How many speculations had he not hatched? How many reports had he not heard read? What quackeries, what smiles and curvets! For he had acclaimed Napoleon, the Cossacks, Louis XVIII, 1830, the working men, every regime, loving power so dearly that he would have paid in order to have the opportunity of selling himself. But he had left behind him the estate of La Fortelle, 3 factories in Picardy, the woods of Crancey in the Yonne, the farm near Orléans, and a great deal of personal property in the form of bills and papers. Frederick thus made an estimate of her fortune, and it would soon, nevertheless, belong to him. First of all, he thought of what people would say. Then he asked himself what present he ought to make to his mother, and he was concerned about his future equipages and about employing an old coachman belonging to his own family as the doorkeeper. Of course, the livery would not be the same. He would convert the large reception room into his own study. There was nothing to prevent him by knocking down 3 walls from setting up a picture gallery on the 2nd floor. Perhaps there might be an opportunity for introducing into the lower portion of the house a hall for Turkish baths. As for Monsieur d'Ambreuse's office, a disagreeable spot, what use could he make of it? These reflections were, from time to time, rudely interrupted by the sounds made by the priest in blowing his nose, or by the good sister in settling the fire. But the actual facts showed that his thoughts rested on a solid foundation. The corpse was there. The eyelids had reopened, and the pupils, although steeped in clammy gloom, had an enigmatic, intolerable expression. Frederick fancied that he saw there a judgment directed against himself, and he felt almost a sort of remorse, for he had never any complaint to make against this man, who, on the contrary— "Come now, an old wretch!" And he looked at the dead man more closely in order to strengthen his mind, mentally addressing him thus: "Well, what? Have I killed you?" Meanwhile, the priest read his breviary. The nun, who sat motionless, had fallen asleep. The wicks of the 3 wax tapers had grown longer. For 2 hours could be heard the heavy rolling of carts making their way to the markets. The window panes began to admit streaks of white. A cab passed. Then a group of donkeys went trotting over the pavement. Then came strokes of hammers, cries of itinerant vendors of wood, and blasts of horns. Already every other sound was blended with the great voice of awakening Paris. Frederick went out to perform the duties assigned to him. He first repaired to the mayor's office to make the necessary declaration. Then, when the medical officer had given him a certificate of death, he called a second time at the municipal buildings in order to name the cemetery which the family had selected and to make arrangements for the funeral ceremonies. The clerk in the office showed him a plan which indicated the mode of interment adopted for the various classes, and a programme giving full particulars with regard to the spectacular portion of the funeral. Would he like to have an open funeral car or a hearse with plumes, plaits on the horses, and aigrettes on the footman, initials, or a coat of arms, funeral lamps, a man to display the family distinctions, and what number of carriages would he require? Frederick did not economize in the slightest degree. Madame d'Ambreuse was determined to spare no expense. After this, he made his way to the church. The curate, who had charge of burials, found fault with the waste of money on funeral pomps. For instance, the officer for the display of armorial distinctions was really useless. It would be far better to have a goodly display of wax tapers. A low mass accompanied by music would be appropriate. Frederick gave written directions to have everything that was agreed upon carried out, with a joint undertaking to defray all the expenses. He went next to the Hôtel de Ville to purchase a piece of ground. A grant of a piece which was 2 meters in length and 1 in breadth cost 500 francs. Did he want a grant for 50 years or forever? "Oh, forever," said Frederick. He took the whole thing seriously and got into a state of intense anxiety about it. In the courtyard of the mansion, a marble cutter was waiting to show him estimates and plans of Greek, Egyptian, and Moorish tombs. But the family architect had already been in consultation with Madame, and on the table in the vestibule there were all sorts of prospectuses with reference to the cleaning of mattresses, the disinfections of rooms, and the various processes of embalming. After dining, he went back to the tailor's shop to order mourning for the servants, and he had still to discharge another function, for the gloves that he had ordered were of beaver, whereas the right kind for a funeral were floss silk. When he arrived next morning, at 10 o'clock, the large reception room was filled with people, and nearly everyone said, on encountering the others, in a melancholy tone, "It's only a month ago since I saw him. Good heavens, it will be the same way with us all. Yes, but let us try to keep it as far away from us as possible." Then there were little smiles of satisfaction, and they even engaged in conversations entirely unsuited to the occasion. At length, the master of the ceremonies, in a black coat in the French fashion and short breeches, with a cloak, cambric mourning bands, a long sword by his side, and a three-cornered hat under his arm, gave utterance, with a bow, to the customary words, "Messieurs, when it shall be your pleasure." The funeral started. It was the market day for flowers on the Place de la Madeleine. It was a fine day, with brilliant sunshine, and the breeze, which shook the canvas tents, a little swelled at the edges the enormous black cloth which was hung over the church gate. The escutcheon of Monsieur d'Ambrose, which covered a square piece of velvet, was repeated there 3 times. It was sable, with an arm sinister, and a clenched hand with a glove argent, with the coronet of a count, and this device, "By every path." The bearers lifted the heavy coffin to the top of the staircase, and they entered the building. The 6 chapels, the hemicycles, and the seats were hung with black. The catafalque at the end of the choir formed, with its large wax tapers, a single focus of yellow lights. At the 2 corners, over the candelabra, flames of spirits of wine were burning. The persons of highest rank took up their position in the sanctuary, and the rest in the nave, and then the office for the dead began. With the exception of a few, the religious ignorance of all was so profound that the master of the ceremonies had, from time to time, to make signs to them to rise, to kneel, or to resume their seats. The organ and the 2 double basses could be heard alternately with the voices. In the intervals of silence, the only sounds that reached the ear were the mumblings of the priest at the altar. Then the music and the chanting went on again. The light of day shone dimly through the 3 cupolas, but the open door let in, as it were, a stream of white radiance, which, entering in a horizontal direction, fell on every uncovered head. And in the air, halfway towards the ceiling of the church, floated a shadow, which was penetrated by the reflection of the gildings that decorated the ribbing of the pendentives and the foliage of the capitals. Frederick, in order to distract his attention, listened to the Dies Irae. He gazed at those around him, or tried to catch a glimpse of the pictures hanging too far above his head, wherein the life of the Magdalene was represented. Luckily, Pellerin came to sit down beside him, and immediately plunged into a long dissertation on the subject of frescoes. The bell began to toll. They left the church. The hearse, adorned with hanging draperies and tall plumes, set out for Père Lachaise, drawn by 4 black horses, with their manes plaited, their heads decked with tufts of feathers, and with large trappings embroidered with silver flowing down to their shoes. The driver of the vehicle, in Hessian boots, wore a 3-cornered hat with a long piece of crape falling down from it. The cords were held by 4 personages: a quaestor of the Chamber of Deputies, a member of the General Council of the Aube, a delegate from the coal mining company, and Fumichon, as a friend. The carriage of the deceased and a dozen mourning coaches followed. The persons attending at the funeral came in the rear, filling up the middle of the boulevard. The passers-by stopped to look at the mournful procession. Women, with their brats in their arms, got up on chairs, and people who had been drinking glasses of beer in the cafes presented themselves at the windows with billiard cues in their hands. The way was long, and, as at formal meals at which people are at first reserved and then expansive, the general deportment speedily relaxed. They talked of nothing but the refusal of an allowance by the Chamber to the President. Monsieur Piscatori had shown himself harsh. Montalembert had been magnificent as usual, and Messieurs Chambal, Pidoux-Creton, in short, the entire committee, would be compelled perhaps to follow the advice of Messieurs Quentin-Beauchort and Dufour. This conversation was continued as they passed through the Rue de la Roquette, with shops on each side, in which could be seen only chains of coloured glass and black circular tablets covered with drawings and letters of gold, which made them resemble grottos full of stalactites and crockery-ware shops. But when they had reached the cemetery gate, everyone instantaneously ceased speaking. The tombs among the trees, broken columns, pyramids, temples, dolmens, obelisks, and Etruscan vaults with doors of bronze. In some of them might be seen funereal boudoirs, so to speak, with rustic armchairs and folding stools. Spiders' webs hung like rags from the little chains of the urns, and the bouquets of satin ribbons and the crucifixes were covered with dust. Everywhere, between the balusters on the tombstones, may be observed crowns of immortelles and chandeliers, vases, flowers, black discs set off with gold letters, and plaster statuettes, little boys or little girls or little angels sustained in the air by brass wires. Several of them have even a roof of zinc overhead. Huge cables made of glass strung together, black, white, or azure, descend from the tops of the monuments to the ends of the flagstones with long folds like boas. The rays of the sun, striking on them, made them scintillate in the midst of the black wooden crosses. The hearse advanced along the broad paths, which are paved like the streets of a city. From time to time the axle-trees cracked. Women, kneeling down, with their dresses trailing in the grass, addressed the dead in tones of tenderness. Little white fumes arose from the green leaves of the yew trees. These came from offerings that had been left behind, waste material that had been burnt. Monsieur d'Ambreuse's grave was close to the graves of Manuel and Benjamin Constant. The soil in this place slopes with an abrupt decline. One has under his feet there the tops of green trees, further down the chimneys of steam pumps, then the entire great city. Frederick found an opportunity of admiring the scene while the various addresses were being delivered. The first was in the name of the Chamber of Deputies, the second in the name of the General Council of the Aube, the third in the name of the Coal Mining Company of Saône-et-Loire, the fourth in the name of the Agricultural Society of the Yonne, and there was another in the name of a philanthropic society. Finally, just as everyone was going away, a stranger began reading a sixth address in the name of the Amiens Society of Antiquaries. And thereupon they all took advantage of the occasion to denounce socialism, of which Monsieur d'Ambreuze had died a victim. It was the effect produced on his mind by the exhibitions of anarchic violence, together with his devotion to order, that had shortened his days. They praised his intellectual powers, his integrity, his generosity, and even his silence as a representative of the people. For, if he was not an orator, he possessed instead those solid qualities 1,000 times more useful, etc., with all the requisite phrases: premature end, eternal regrets, the better land, farewell, or rather no, au revoir. The clay mingled with stones fell on the coffin, and he would never again be a subject for discussion in society. However, there were a few allusions to him as the persons who had followed his remains left the cemetery. Hussonnet, who would have to give an account of the interment in the newspapers, took up all the addresses in a chaffing style, for, in truth, the worthy d'Ambreuze had been one of the most notable porte de vin of the last reign. Then the citizens were driving in the mourning coaches to their various places of business. The ceremony had not lasted very long. They congratulated themselves on the circumstance. Frederick returned to his own abode quite worn out. When he presented himself next day at Madame d'Ambreuse's residence, he was informed that she was busy below stairs in the room where Monsieur d'Ambreuze had kept his papers. The cardboard receptacles and the different drawers had been opened confusedly, and the account books had been flung about right and left. A roll of papers on which were endorsed the words "Repayment hopeless" lay on the ground. He was near falling over it and picked it up. Madame d'Ambrose had sunk back in the armchair so that he did not see her. "Well, where are you? What is the matter?" She sprang to her feet with a bound. "What is the matter? I am ruined! Ruined! Do you understand?" Monsieur Adolphe Langlois, the notary, had sent her a message to call at his office, and had informed her about the contents of a will made by her husband before their marriage. He had bequeathed everything to Cécile, and the other will was lost. Frederick turned very pale. No doubt she had not made sufficient search. "Well then, look yourself!" said Madame d'Ambrose, pointing at the objects contained in the room. The 2 strong boxes were gaping wide, having been broken open with blows of a cleaver, and she had turned up the desk, rummaged in the cupboards, and shaken the straw mattings when, all of a sudden uttering a piercing cry, she dashed into a corner where she had just noticed a little box with a brass lock. She opened it. Nothing. "Ah, the wretch! I who took such devoted care of him!" Then she burst into sobs. "Perhaps it is somewhere else?" said Frederick. "Oh no, it was there, in that strong box. I saw it there lately. 'Tis burned. I'm certain of it." One day, in the early stage of his illness, Monsieur d'Ambrose had gone down to this room to sign some documents. "'Tis then he must have done the trick." And she fell back on a chair, crushed. A mother grieving beside an empty cradle was not more woeful than Madame d'Ambrose was at the sight of the open strong boxes. Indeed, her sorrow, in spite of the baseness of the motive which inspired it, appeared so deep that he tried to console her by reminding her that, after all, she was not reduced to sheer want. "It is want, when I am not in a position to offer you a large fortune." She had not more than 30,000 livres a year, without taking into account the mansion, which was worth from 18 to 20,000 perhaps. Although to Frederick this would have been opulence, he felt none the less a certain amount of disappointment. Farewell to his dreams, and to all the splendid existence on which he had intended to enter. Honour compelled him to marry Madame d'Ambrose. For a minute he reflected. Then, in a tone of tenderness, "I'll always have yourself." She threw himself into his arms, and he clasped her to his breast with an emotion in which there was a slight element of admiration for himself. Madame d'Ambrose, whose tears had ceased to flow, raised her face, beaming all over with happiness, and, seizing his hand, "Ah, I never doubted you. I knew I could count on you." The young man did not like this tone of anticipated certainty with regard to what he was pluming himself on as a noble action. Then she brought him into her own apartment, and they began to arrange their plans for the future. Frederick should now consider the best way of advancing himself in life. She even gave him excellent advice with reference to his candidature. The first point was to be acquainted with 2 or 3 phrases borrowed from political economy. It was necessary to take up a specialty, such as the stud system, for example, to write a number of notes on questions of local interest, to have always at his disposal post offices or tobacconists' shops, and to do a heap of little services. In this respect, Monsieur d'Ambrose had shown himself a true model. Thus, on one occasion in the country, he had drawn up his wagonette, full of friends of his, in front of a cobbler's stall, and had bought a dozen pair of shoes for his guests, and for himself a dreadful pair of boots, which he had not even the courage to wear for an entire fortnight. This anecdote put them into a good humour. She related others, and that with a renewal of grace, youthfulness, and wit. She approved of his notion of taking a trip immediately to Nogent. Their parting was an affectionate one. Then, on the threshold, she murmured once more, "You love me, do you not?" "Eternally," was his reply. End of Chapter 17, Part 1. Recording by Kate Mackenzie. Chapter 17, Part 2 of Sentimental Education. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Sentimental Education by Gustave Flaubert. Chapter 17. A Strange Betrothal. Part 2. A messenger was waiting for him at his own house with a line written in lead pencil informing him that Rosinette was about to be confined. He had been so much preoccupied for the past few days that he had not bestowed a thought upon the matter. She had been placed in a special establishment at Chaillot. Frederick took a cab and set out for this institution. At the corner of the Rue de Marbeuf, he read on a board in big letters, "Private lying-in hospital, kept by Madame Alessandri, first-class midwife, ex-pupil of the maternity, author of various works, etc." Then in the centre of the street over the door, a little side door, there was another signboard. Private Hospital of Madame Alessandri, with all her titles. Frederick gave a knock. A chambermaid, with the figure of an abigail, introduced him into the reception room, which was adorned with a mahogany table and armchairs of garnet velvet, and with a clock under a globe. Almost immediately, Madame appeared. She was a tall brunette of 40, with a slender waist, fine eyes, and the manners of good society. She apprised Frederick of the mother's happy delivery, and brought him up to her apartment. Rosinette broke into a smile of unutterable bliss, and, as if drowned in the floods of love that were suffocating her, she said in a low tone, "A boy, there, pointing towards a cradle close to her bed. He flung open the curtains and saw, wrapped up in linen, a yellowish-red object, exceedingly shriveled-looking, which had a bad smell, and which was bawling lustily. "Embrace him." He replied in order to hide his repugnance, "But I am afraid of hurting him." "No, no." Then with the tips of his lips he kissed his child. "How like you he is!" And with her 2 weak arms she clung to his neck with an outburst of feeling which he had never witnessed on her part before. The remembrance of Madame d'Ambreuse came back to him. He reproached himself as a monster for having deceived this poor creature, who loved and suffered with all the sincerity of her nature. For several days he remained with her till night. She felt happy in this quiet place. The window shutters in front of it remained always closed. Her room, hung with bright chintz, looked out on a large garden. Madame Alessandri, whose only shortcoming was that she liked to talk about her intimate acquaintanceship with eminent physicians, showed her the utmost attention. Her associates, nearly all provincial young ladies, were exceedingly bored, as they had nobody to come to see them. Rosinette saw that they regarded her with envy, and told this to Frederick with pride. It was desirable to speak low, nevertheless. The partitions were thin, and everyone stood listening at hiding places in spite of the constant thrumming of the pianos. At last he was about to take his departure for Nogent, when he got a letter from des Lauriers. 2 fresh candidates had offered themselves, the one a conservative, the other a red. A third, whatever he might be, would have no chance. It was all Frederick's fault. He had let the lucky moment pass by. He should have come sooner and stirred himself. "You have not even been seen at the Agricultural Assembly." The advocate blamed him for not having any newspaper connection. "Ah, if you had followed my advice long ago! If we had only a public print of our own!" He laid special stress on this point. However, many persons who would have voted for him out of consideration for Monsieur d'Ambreuse abandoned him now. Des Lauriers was one of the number. Not having anything more to expect from the capitalist, he had thrown over his protégé. Frederick took the letter to show it to Madame d'Ambreuse. "You have not been to Nogent, then?" said she. "Why do you ask?" "Because I saw Des Lauriers 3 days ago." Having learned that her husband was dead, the advocate had come to make a report about the coal mines, and to offer his services to her as a man of business. This seemed strange to Frederick. And what was his friend doing down there? Madame d'Ambreuse wanted to know how he had spent his time since they had parted. "I have been ill," he replied. "You ought at least to have told me about it." "Oh, it wasn't worthwhile. Besides, he had to settle a heap of things, to keep appointments and to pay visits." From that time forth he led a double life, sleeping religiously at the Maréchal's abode and passing the afternoon with Madame d'Ambreuse, so that there was scarcely a single hour of freedom left to him in the middle of the day. The infant was in the country at Annise. They went to see it once a week. The wet nurse's house was on rising ground in the village, at the end of a little yard as dark as a pit, with straw on the ground, hens here and there, and a vegetable cart under the shed. Rosanette would begin by frantically kissing her baby, and, seized with a kind of delirium, would keep moving to and fro, trying to milk the she-goat, eating big pieces of bread and inhaling the odour of manure. She even wanted to put a little of it into her handkerchief. Then they took long walks, in the course of which she went into the nurseries, tore off branches from the lilac trees which hung down over the walls, and exclaimed, "Gee-ho, donkey!" to the asses that were drawing cars along, and stopped to gaze through the gate into the interior of one of the lovely gardens. Or else the wet nurse would take the child and place it under the shade of a walnut tree, and for hours the two women would keep talking the most tiresome nonsense. Frederick, not far away from them, gazed at the beds of vines on the slopes, with here and there a clump of trees, at the dusty paths resembling strips of grey ribbon, at the houses which showed white and red spots in the midst of the greenery, and sometimes the smoke of a locomotive stretched out horizontally to the bases of the hills, covered with foliage like a gigantic ostrich's feather, the thin end of which was disappearing from view. Then his eyes once more rested on his son. He imagined the child grown into a young man. He would make a companion of him. But perhaps he would be a blockhead, a wretched creature. In any event, he was always oppressed by the illegality of the infant's birth. It would have been better if he had never been born. And Frederick would murmur, "Poor child," his heart swelling with feelings of unutterable sadness. They often missed the last train. Then Madame d'Ambreuse would scold him for his want of punctuality. He would invent some falsehood. It was necessary to invent some explanations too, to satisfy Rosanette. She could not understand how he spent all his evenings. And when she sent a messenger to his house, he was never there. One day, when he chanced to be at home, the two women made their appearance almost at the same time. He got the Marechal to go away, and concealed Madame d'Ambreuse, pretending that his mother was coming up to Paris. Ere long he found these lies amusing. He would repeat to one the oath which he had just uttered to the other, send them bouquets of the same sort, write to them at the same time, and then would institute a comparison between them. There was a third always present in his thoughts. The impossibility of possessing her seemed to him a justification of his perfidies, which were intensified by the fact that he had to practice them alternately, and the more he deceived, no matter which of the two, the fonder of him she grew, as if the love of one of them added heat to that of the other, and as if by a sort of emulation, each of them was seeking to make him forget the other. "Admire my confidence in you," said Madame d'Ambreuse one day to him, opening a sheet of paper in which she was informed that Monsieur Moreau and a certain Rose Brun were living together as husband and wife. "Can it be that this is the lady of the races?" "What an absurdity!" he returned. "Let me have a look at it." The letter, written in Roman characters, had no signature. Madame d'Ambreuse, in the beginning, had tolerated this mistress, who furnished a cloak for their adultery. But, as her passion became stronger, she had insisted on a rupture, a thing which had been effected long since, according to Frederick's account. And when he had ceased to protest, she replied, half closing her eyes, in which shone a look like the point of a stiletto under a muslin robe, "Well, and the other?" "What other?" "The earthenware dealer's wife." He shrugged his shoulders disdainfully. She did not press the matter. But a month later, while they were talking about honour and loyalty, and he was boasting about his own, in a casual sort of way for the sake of precaution, she said to him, "It is true. You are acting uprightly. You don't go back there any more." Frederick, who at the moment thinking of the Marechal, stammered, "Where, pray?" "To Madame Arnoux." He implored her to tell him from whom she got the information. It was through her second dressmaker, Madame Regimbard. So, she knew all about his life, and he knew nothing about hers. In the meantime, he had found in her dressing room the miniature of a gentleman with long moustaches. Was this the same person about whose suicide a vague story had been told him at one time? But there was no way of learning any more about it. However, what was the use of it? The hearts of women are like little pieces of furniture wherein things are secreted, full of drawers fitted into each other. One hurts himself, breaks his nails in opening them, and then finds within only some withered flower, a few grains of dust, or emptiness. And then perhaps he felt afraid of learning too much about the matter. She made him refuse invitations where she was unable to accompany him, stuck to his side, was afraid of losing him, and in spite of this union, which was every day becoming stronger, all of a sudden abysses disclosed themselves between the pair about the most trifling questions, an estimate of an individual or a work of art. She had a style of playing on the piano which was correct and hard. Her spiritualism, Madame Lampreuse believed in the transmigration of souls into the stars, did not prevent her from taking the utmost care of her cash box. She was haughty towards her servants. Her eyes remained dry at the sight of the rags of the poor. In the expressions of which she habitually made use, a candid egoism manifested itself. What concern is that of mine? I should be very silly. What need have I? And 1,000 little acts incapable of analysis revealed hateful qualities in her. She would have listened behind doors. She could not help lying to her confessor. Through a spirit of despotism, she insisted on Frederick going to the church with her on Sunday. He obeyed and carried her prayer book. The loss of the property she had expected to inherit had changed her considerably. These marks of grief, which people attributed to the death of Monsieur d'Ambrose, rendered her interesting, and, as in former times, she had a great number of visitors. Since Frederick's defeat at the election, she was ambitious of obtaining for both of them an embassy in Germany. Therefore, the first thing they should do was submit to the reigning ideas. Some persons were in favour of the empire, others of the Orléans family, and others of the Comte de Chambord. But they were all of one opinion as to the urgency of decentralization, and several expedients were proposed with that view, such as to cut up Paris into many large streets in order to establish villages there, to transfer the seat of government to Versailles, to have the schools set up at Bourges, to suppress the libraries, and to entrust everything to the generals of division. And they glorified a rustic existence on the assumption that the uneducated man had naturally more sense than other men. Hatreds increased. Hatred of primary teachers and wine merchants, of the classes of philosophy, of the courses of lectures on history, of novels, red waistcoats, long beards, of independence in any shape, or any manifestation of individuality. For it was necessary to restore the principle of authority. Let it be exercised in the name of no matter whom. Let it come from no matter where, as long as it was force, authority. The Conservatives now talked in the very same way as Senecal. Frederick was no longer able to understand their drift, and once more he found at the house of his former mistress the same remarks uttered by the same men. The salons of the unmarried women, it was from this period that their importance dates, were a sort of neutral ground where reactionaries of different kinds met. Hussonnet, who gave himself up to the depreciation of contemporary glories, a good thing for the restoration of order, inspired Rosinette with a longing to have evening parties like any other. He undertook to publish accounts of them, and, first of all, he brought a man of grave deportment, Fumichon. Then came Nonancourt, Monsieur de Grémonville, the Sieur de la Sillois, ex-prefect, and Sisi, who was now an agriculturist in Lower Brittany, and more Christian than ever. In addition, men who had at one time been the Maréchal's lovers, such as the Baron de Comminges, the Comte de Jumillac, and others, presented themselves, and Frederick was annoyed by their free and easy behaviour. In order that he might assume the attitude of master in the house, he increased the rate of expenditure there. Then he went in for keeping a groom, took a new habitation, got a fresh supply of furniture. These displays of extravagance were useful for the purpose of making his alliance appear less out of proportion with his pecuniary position. The result was that his means were soon terribly reduced, and Rosinette was entirely ignorant of the fact. One of the lower middle class, who had lost caste, she adored domestic life, a quiet little home. However, it gave her pleasure to have an at-home day. In referring to persons of her own class, she called them "those women." She wished to be a society lady, and believed herself to be one. She begged of him not to smoke in the drawing-room any more, and for the sake of good form tried to make herself look thin. She played her part badly, after all, for she grew serious, and even before going to bed always exhibited a little melancholy, just as there are cypress trees at the door of a tavern. He found out the cause of it. She was dreaming of marriage. She, too. Frederick was exasperated at this. Besides, he recalled to mind her appearance at Madame Arnoul's house, and then he cherished a certain spite against her for having held out against him so long. He made inquiries nonetheless as to who her lovers had been. She denied having had any relations with any of the persons he mentioned. A sort of jealous feeling took possession of him. He irritated her by asking questions about presents that had been made to her and were still being made to her. And, in proportion to the exciting effect which the lower portion of her nature produced upon him, he was drawn towards her by momentary illusions which ended in hate. Her words, her voice, her smile, all had an unpleasant effect on him, and especially her glances with that woman's eye forever limpid and foolish. Sometimes he felt so tired of her that he would have seen her die without being moved at it. But how could he get into a passion with her? She was so mild that there was no hope of picking a quarrel with her. Des Lauriers reappeared and explained his sojourn at Nogent by saying that he was making arrangements to buy a lawyer's office. Frederick was glad to see him again. It was somebody, and as a third person in the house, he helped to break the monotony. The advocate dined with them from time to time, and whenever any little disputes arose, always took Rosinette's part, so that Frederick on one occasion said to him, "Ah, you can have with her if it amuses you." So much did he long for some chance of getting rid of her. About the middle of the month of June, she was served with an order made by the law courts, by which Maître Annise Gauthiereau, sheriff's officer, called on her to pay him 4,000 francs due to Mademoiselle Clémence Vatnaz. If not, he would come to make a seizure on her. In fact, of the 4 bills which she had at various times signed, only one had been paid, the money which she happened to get since then having been spent on other things that she required. She rushed off at once to see Arnoux. He now lived in the Faubourg Saint-Germain, and the porter was unable to tell her the name of the street. She made her way next to the houses of several friends of hers, could not find one of them at home, and came back in a state of utter despair. She did not wish to tell Frederick anything about it, fearing lest this new occurrence might prejudice the chance of a marriage between them. On the following morning, Monsieur Athanase Gauthiereau presented himself with 2 assistants close behind him. One of them sallow, with a mean-looking face and an expression of devouring envy in his glance. The other wearing a collar and straps drawn very tightly, with a sort of thimble of black taffeta on his index finger, and both ignobly dirty, with greasy necks and the sleeves of their coats too short. Their employer, a very good-looking man, on the contrary, began by apologizing for the disagreeable duty he had to perform, while at the same time he threw a look around the room. "Full of pretty things, upon my word of honour," he added, "not to speak of the things that can't be seized." At a gesture, the 2 bailiffs' men disappeared. Then he became twice as polite as before. Could anyone believe that a lady so charming would not have a genuine friend? A sale of her goods under an order of the courts would be a real misfortune. One never gets over a thing like that. He tried to excite her fears, then, seeing that she was very much agitated, suddenly assumed a paternal tone. He knew the world. He had been brought into business relations with all these ladies, and, as he mentioned their names, he examined the frames of the pictures on the walls. They were old pictures of the worthy Arnoux, sketches by Saint-Barry, watercolours by Burieux, and 3 landscapes by Dittmer. It was evident that Rosinette was ignorant of their value. Maître Gauthiereau turned round to her. "Look here, to show that I am a decent fellow, do one thing. Give me up those Dittmers here, and I am ready to pay all. Do you agree?" At that moment, Frederick, who had been informed about the matter by Delphine in the anteroom, and who had just seen the 2 assistants, came in with his hat on his head in a rude fashion. Maître Gauthiereau resumed his dignity, and, as the door had been left open, "Come on, gentlemen, write down. In the second room, let us say, an oak table with its 2 leaves, 2 sideboards." Frederick here stopped him, asking whether there was not some way of preventing the seizure. "Oh, certainly. Who paid for the furniture? I did. Well, draw up a claim. You still have time to do it. Maître Gauthiereau did not take long in writing out his official report, wherein he directed that Mademoiselle Brun should attend at an inquiry in chambers with reference to the ownership of the furniture, and having done this, he withdrew. Frederick uttered no reproach. He gazed at the traces of mud left on the floor by the bailiff's shoes, and, speaking to himself, "It will soon be necessary to look about for money." "Ah, my God, how stupid I am!" said the Maréchal. She ransacked a drawer, took out a letter, and made her way rapidly to the Languedoc Gas Lighting Company in order to get the transfer of her shares. She came back an hour later. The interest in the shares had been sold to another. The clerk had said, in answer to her demand, while examining the sheet of paper containing Arnoul's written promise to her, "This document in no way constitutes you the proprietor of the shares. The company has no cognizance of the matter." In short, he sent her away unceremoniously while she choked with rage. And Frederick would have to go to Arnoul's house at once to have the matter cleared up. But Arnoul would perhaps imagine that he had come to recover in an indirect fashion the 15,000 francs due on the mortgage which he had lost. And then this claim, from a man who had been his mistress's lover, seemed to him a piece of baseness. Selecting a middle course, he went to the D'Ambreuse mansion to get Madame Regimbaud's address, sent a messenger to her residence, and in this way ascertained the name of the café which the citizen now haunted. It was the little café on the Place de la Bastille, in which he sat all day in the corner to the right at the lower end of the establishment, never moving any more than if he were a portion of the building. After having gone successively through the half-cup of coffee, the glass of grog, the bishop, the glass of mulled wine, and even the red wine and water, he fell back on beer, and every half hour he let fall this word, bock, having reduced his language to what was actually indispensable. Frederick asked him if he saw Arnoul occasionally. "No." "Look here, why?" "An imbecile." Politics, perhaps, kept them apart, and so Frederick thought it a judicious thing to inquire about Compin. "What a brute!" said Regimbaud. "How is that?" "His calf's head." "Huh? Explain to me what the calf's head is." Regimbaud's face wore a contemptuous smile. "Some tomfoolery." After a long interval of silence, Frederick went on to ask, "So, then, he has changed his address?" "Who?" "Arnoul." "Yes. Rue de Fleurs." "What number?" "Do I associate with the Jesuits?" "What? Jesuits?" The citizen replied angrily, "With the money of a patriot whom I introduced to him, this pig has set up a dealer in beads." "It isn't possible." "Go there and see for yourself." It was perfectly true. Arnoul, enfeebled by a fit of sickness, had turned religious. Besides, he had always had a stock of religion in his composition, and, with that mixture of commercialism and ingenuity which was natural to him, in order to gain salvation and fortune both together, he had begun to traffic in religious objects. Frederick had no difficulty in discovering his establishment, on whose signboard appeared these words: Emporium of Gothic Art. Restoration of articles used in ecclesiastical ceremonies. Church ornaments, polychromatic sculpture, frankincense of the Magi, kings, etc., etc. At the two corners of the shop window rose two wooden statues streaked with gold, cinnabar, and azure, a St. John the Baptist with his sheepskin, and a St. Genevieve with roses in her apron and a distaff under her arm. Next, groups in plaster, a good sister teaching a little girl, a mother on her knees beside a little bed, and 3 collegians before the holy table. The prettiest object there was a kind of chalet representing the interior of a crib with the ass, the ox, and the child Jesus stretched on straw, real straw. From the top to the bottom of the shelves could be seen medals by the dozen, every sort of beads, holy water basins in the form of shells, and portraits of ecclesiastical dignitaries, amongst whom Monseigneur Affre and our Holy Father shone forth with smiles on their faces. Arnoul sat asleep at his counter with his head down. He had aged terribly. He had, even round his temples, a wreath of rosebuds, and the reflection of the gold crosses touched by the rays of the sun fell over him. Frederick was filled with sadness at this spectacle of decay. Through devotion to the Marechal, he, however, submitted to the ordeal and stepped forward. At the end of the shop, Madame Arnoux showed herself. Thereupon he turned on his heel. "I couldn't see him," he said when he came back to Rosinette, and in vain he went on to promise that he would write at once to his notary at Havre for some money. She flew into a rage. She had never seen a man so weak, so flabby. While she was enduring 1,000 privations, other people were enjoying themselves. Frederick was thinking about poor Madame Arnoux and picturing to himself the heart-rending impoverishment of her surroundings. He had seated himself before the writing desk, and, as Rosinette's voice still kept up its bitter railing, "Ah, in the name of heaven, hold your tongue! Perhaps you are going to defend them?" "Well, yes," he exclaimed, "for what's the cause of this display of fury?" "But why is it that you don't want to make them pay up? 'Tis for fear of vexing your old flame. Confess it." He felt an inclination to smash her head with the timepiece. Words failed him. He relapsed into silence. Rosinette, as she walked up and down the room, continued, "I am going to hurl a writ at this Arnoux of yours. Oh, I don't want your assistance, but I'll get legal advice." 3 days later, Delphine rushed abruptly into the room where her mistress sat. "Madame, madame, there's a man here with a pot of paste who has given me a fright." Rosinette made her way down to the kitchen and saw there a vagabond whose face was pitted with smallpox. Moreover, one of his arms was paralyzed, and he was 3/4 drunk and hiccuped every time he attempted to speak. This was Maître Gauthiereau's bill sticker. The objections raised against the seizure having been overruled, the sale followed as a matter of course. For his trouble in getting up the stairs he demanded, in the first place, a half glass of brandy. Then he wanted another favour, namely, tickets for the theatre, on the assumption that the lady of the house was an actress. After this, he indulged for some minutes in winks, whose import was perfectly incomprehensible. Finally, he declared that for 40 sous he would tear off the corners of the poster which he had already affixed to the door below stairs. Rosinette found herself referred to by name in it, a piece of exceptional harshness which showed the spite of the Vatnas. She had at one time exhibited sensibility, and had even, while suffering from the effects of a heartache, written to Béranger for his advice. But under the ravages of life's storms, her spirit had become soured, for she had been forced in turn to give lessons on the piano, to act as manageress of a table d'hôte, to assist others in writing for the fashion journals, to sublet apartments, and to traffic in lace in the world of light women, her relations with whom enabled her to make herself useful to many persons, and amongst others to Arnoux. She had formerly been employed in a commercial establishment. There it was one of her functions to pay the workwomen, and for each of them there were 2 livres, one of which always remained in her hands. Dusardier, who through kindness kept the amount payable to a girl named Hortense Bazelin, presented himself one day at the cash office at the moment when Mademoiselle Vatnas was presenting this girl's account, 1,682 francs, which the cashier paid her. Now, on the very day before this, Dusardier had entered down the sum as 1,082 in the girl Bazelin's book. He asked to have it given back to him on some pretext. Then, anxious to bury out of sight the story of this theft, he stated that he had lost it. The workwoman ingenuously repeated this falsehood to Mademoiselle Vatnas, and the latter, in order to satisfy her mind about the matter, came with a show of indifference to talk to the shopman on the subject. He contented himself with the answer, "I have burned it." That was all. A little while afterwards she quitted the house, without believing that the book had been really destroyed, and filled with the idea that Dusardier had preserved it. On hearing that he had been wounded, she rushed to his abode with the object of getting it back. Then, having discovered nothing in spite of the closest searches, she was seized with respect, and presently with love, for this youth, so loyal, so gentle, so heroic, and so strong. At her age, such good fortune in an affair of the heart was a thing that one would not expect. She threw herself into it with the appetite of an ogress, and she had given up literature, socialism, the consoling doctrines and the generous utopias, the course of lectures which she had projected on the desubalternization of woman. Everything, even Delmar himself. Finally, she offered to unite herself to Dusadier in marriage. Although she was his mistress, he was not at all in love with her. Besides, he had not forgotten her theft. Then she was too wealthy for him. He refused her offer. Thereupon, with tears in her eyes, she told him about what she had dreamed. It was to have for both of them a confectioner's shop. She possessed the capital that was required beforehand for the purpose, and next week this would be increased to the extent of 4,000 francs. By way of explanation, she referred to the proceedings she had taken against the Maréchal. Dusadier was annoyed at this on account of his friend. He recalled to mind the cigar holder that had been presented to him at the guardhouse, the evenings spent in the Quai Napoleon, the many pleasant chats, the books lent to him, the 1,000 acts of kindness which Frederick had done in his behalf. He begged of the Vatnas to abandon the proceedings. She rallied him on his good nature, while exhibiting an antipathy against Rosinette which he could not understand. She longed only for wealth, in fact, in order to crush her, by and by, with her four-wheeled carriage. Dusadier was terrified by these black abysses of hate, and when he had ascertained what was the exact day fixed for the sale, he hurried out. On the following morning he made his appearance at Frederick's house with an embarrassed countenance. "I owe you an apology." "For what, pray?" "You must take me for an ingrate, I whom she is the—" he faltered. "Oh, I'll see no more of her. I am not going to be her accomplice." And, as the other was gazing at him in astonishment, "Isn't your mistress's furniture to be sold in 3 days' time? Who told you that?" "Herself, de Vatnas. But I am afraid of giving you offence." "Impossible, my dear friend." "Ah, that is true. You are so good." And he held out to him in a cautious fashion a hand in which he clasped a little pocketbook made of sheep leather. It contained 4,000 francs, all his savings. "What? Oh, no, no." "I knew well I would wound your feelings," returned Dusadier with a tear in the corner of his eye. Frederick pressed his hand, and the honest fellow went on in a piteous tone. "Take the money. Give me that much pleasure. I am in such a state of despair. Can it be, furthermore, that all is over? I thought we should be happy when the revolution had come. Do you remember what a beautiful thing it was? How freely we breathed. But here we are, flung back into a worse condition of things than ever. Now they are killing our republic, just as they killed the other one, the Roman, and poor Venice, poor Poland, poor Hungary. What abominable deeds! First of all, they knocked down the trees of liberty. Then they restricted the right to vote, shut up the clubs, re-established the censorship, and surrendered to the priests the power of teaching, so that we might look out for the Inquisition. Why not? The Conservatives want to give us a taste of the stick. The newspapers are fined merely for pronouncing an opinion in favour of abolishing the death penalty. Paris is overflowing with bayonets. 16 departments are in a state of siege. And then the demand for amnesty is again rejected." He placed both hands on his forehead, then, spreading out his arms as if his mind were in a distracted state. "If, however, we only made the effort. If we were only sincere, we might understand each other. But no, the workmen are no better than the capitalists, you see. At Elbeuf recently, they refused to help at a fire. There are wretches who profess to regard Barbès as an aristocrat. In order to make the people ridiculous, they want to get nominated for the presidency. Nadeau, a Mason. Just imagine. And there is no way out of it. No remedy. Everybody is against us. For my part, I have never done any harm. And yet this is like a weight pressing down on my stomach. If this state of things continues, I'll go mad. I have a mind to do away with myself, I tell you. I want no money for myself. You'll pay it back to me. Deuce, take it. I am lending it to you." Frederick, who felt himself constrained by necessity, ended up taking the 4,000 francs from him. And so they had no more disquietude so far as the Vatnas was concerned. But it was not long ere Rosinette was defeated in her action against Arnoux, and through sheer obstinacy she wished to appeal. Deslauriers exhausted his energies in trying to make her understand that Arnoux' promise constituted neither a gift nor a regular transfer. She did not even pay the slightest attention to him, her notion being that the law was unjust. It was because she was a woman. Men backed up each other amongst themselves. In the end, however, she followed his advice. He made himself so much at home in the house that, on several occasions, he brought Sentimental to dine there. Frederick, who had advanced him money, and even got his own tailor to supply him with clothes, did not like this unceremoniousness, and the advocate gave his old clothes to the socialist, whose means of existence were now of an exceedingly uncertain character. He was, however, anxious to be of service to Rosinette. One day, when she showed him a dozen shares in the Kaolin Company, that enterprise which led to Arnoux being cast in damages to the extent of 30,000 francs, he said to her, "But this is a shady transaction, and you have now a grand chance." She had the right to call on him to pay her debts. In the first place, she could prove that he was jointly bound to pay all the company's liabilities, since he had certified personal debts as collective debts. In short, he had embezzled sums which were payable only to the company. All this renders him guilty of fraudulent bankruptcy under Articles 586 and 587 of the Commercial Code, and you may be sure my pet will send him packing. Rosinette threw herself on his neck. He entrusted her case next day to his former master, not having time to devote attention to it himself, as he had business at Nogent. In case of any urgency, Sentimental could write to him. His negotiations for the purchase of an office were a mere pretext. He spent his time at Monsieur Roch's house, where he had begun not only by sounding the praises of their friend, but by imitating his manners and language as much as possible. And in this way he had gained Louise's confidence, while he won over that of her father by making an attack on Ledru Rollin. If Frederick did not return, it was because he mingled in aristocratic society, and gradually Deslauriers gave them to understand that he was in love with somebody, that he had a child, and that he was keeping a fallen creature. The despair of Louise was intense. The indignation of Madame Moreau was not less strong. She saw her son whirling towards the bottom of a gulf, the depth of which could not be determined, was wounded in her religious ideas as to propriety, and, as it were, experienced a sense of personal dishonour. Then, all of a sudden, her physiognomy underwent a change. To the questions which people put to her with regard to Frederick, she replied in a sly fashion, "He is well, quite well." She was aware that he was about to be married to Madame d'Ambrose. The date of the event had been fixed, and he was even trying to think of some way of making Rosinette swallow the thing. About the middle of autumn she won her action with reference to the Kaolin shares. Frederick was informed about it by Sentimental, whom he met at his own door on his way back from the courts. It had been held that Monsieur Arnoux was privy to all the frauds, and the ex-tutor had such an air of making merry over it that Frederick prevented him from coming further, assuring Sentimental that he would convey the intelligence to Rosinette. He presented himself before her with a look of irritation on his face. "Well, now you are satisfied." But without minding what he had said, "Look here," and she pointed towards her child, which was lying in a cradle close to the fire. She had found it so sick at the house of the wet nurse that morning that she had brought it back with her to Paris. All the infant's limbs were exceedingly thin, and the lips were covered with white specks, which in the interior of the mouth became, so to speak, clots of blood-stained milk. "What did the doctor say?" "Oh, the doctor! He pretends that the journey has increased his... I don't know what it is, some name in ite. In short, that he has the thrush. Do you know what that is?" Frederick replied without hesitation. "Certainly," adding that it was nothing. But in the evening he was alarmed by the child's debilitated look, and by the progress of these whitish spots resembling mould, as if life, already abandoning this little frame, had left now nothing but matter from which vegetation was sprouting. His hands were cold. He was no longer able to drink anything, and the nurse, another woman, whom the porter had gone and taken on chance at an office, kept repeating, "It seems to me he's very low, very low." Rosinette was up all night with the child. In the morning she went to look for Frederick. "Just come and look at him. He doesn't move any longer." In fact, he was dead. She took him up, shook him, clasped him in her arms, calling him most tender names, covered him with kisses, broke into sobs, turned herself from one side to the other in a state of distraction, tore her hair, uttered a number of shrieks, and then let herself sink on the edge of the divan, where she lay with her mouth open and a flood of tears rushing from her wildly glaring eyes. Then a torpor fell upon her, and all became still in the apartment. The furniture was overturned. 2 or 3 napkins were lying on the floor. It struck 6. The nightlight had gone out. Frederick, as he gazed at the scene, could almost believe that he was dreaming. His heart was oppressed with anguish. It seemed to him that this death was only a beginning, and that behind it was a worse calamity, which was just about to come on. Suddenly, Rosinette said in an appealing tone, "We'll preserve the body, shall we not?" She wished to have the dead child embalmed. There were many objections to this. The principal one, in Frederick's opinion, was that the thing was impracticable in the case of children so young. A portrait would be better. She adopted this idea. He wrote a line to Pellerin, and Delphine hastened to deliver it. Pellerin arrived speedily, anxious by this display of zeal to efface all recollection of his former conduct. The first thing he said was, "Poor little angel! Oh my God, what a misfortune!" But gradually, the artist in him getting the upper hand, he declared that nothing could be made out of those yellowish eyes, that livid face, that it was a real case of still life, and would therefore require very great talent to treat it effectively, and so he murmured, "Oh, 'tisn't easy, 'tisn't easy." "No matter, as long as it is lifelike," urged Rosinette. "Pooh! What do I care about a thing being lifelike? Down with realism. 'Tis the spirit that must be portrayed by the painter. Let me alone. I am going to try to conjure up what it ought to be." He reflected with his left hand clasping his brow and with his right hand clutching his elbow. Then, all of a sudden, I have an idea. A pastel, with coloured mezzo tints, almost spread out flat. A lovely model could be obtained with the outer surface alone. He sent the chambermaid to look for his box of colours. Then, having a chair under his feet and another by his side, he began to throw out great touches with as much complacency as if he had drawn them in accordance with the bust. He praised the little St. John of Correggio, the Infanta Rosa of Velasquez, the milk-white flesh tints of Reynolds, the distinction of Lawrence, and especially the child with long hair that sits in Lady Gower's lap. Besides, could you find anything more charming than these little toads? The type of the sublime, Raphael has proved it by his Madonnas, is probably a mother with her child. Rosinette, who felt herself stifling, went away, and presently Pellerin said, "Well, about Arnoux, you know what has happened?" "No. What?" However, it was bound to end that way. "What has happened, might I ask?" "Perhaps by this time he is— Excuse me." The artist got up in order to raise the head of the little corpse higher. "You were saying?" Frederick resumed. And Pellerin, half closing his eyes in order to take his dimensions better, "I was saying that our friend Arnoux is perhaps by this time locked up." Then, in a tone of satisfaction, "Just give a little glance at it. Is that the thing?" "Yes, 'tis quite right. But about Arnoux?" Pellerin laid down his pencil. "As far as I could understand, he was sued by one Mignot, an intimate friend of Regimbard. A long-headed fellow that, eh? What an idiot. Just imagine, one day— What? It's not Regimbard that's in question, is it?" "It is indeed." "Well, yesterday evening Arnoux had to produce 12,000 francs. If not, he was a ruined man." "Oh, this perhaps is exaggerated," said Frederick. "Not a bit. It looked to me a very serious business, very serious." At that moment Rosinette reappeared with red spots under her eyes which glowed like dabs of paint. She sat down near the drawing and gazed at it. Pellerin made a sign to the other to hold his tongue on account of her. But Frederick, without minding her— "Nevertheless, I can't believe—" "I tell you, I met him yesterday," said the artist, "at 7 o'clock in the evening in the Rue Jacob. He had even taken the precaution to have his passport with him. And he spoke about embarking from Havre, he and his whole camp." "What? With his wife?" "No doubt. He is too much of a family man to live by himself." "Are you sure of this?" "Certain, faith. Where do you expect him to find 12,000 francs? Frederick took 2 or 3 turns around the room. He panted for breath, bit his lips, and then snatched up his hat. "Where are you going now?" said Rosinette. He made no reply, and the next moment he had disappeared. End of chapter 17, part 2. Recording by Kate Mackenzie.
Chapter 18 of Sentimental Education. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by DCutyCat in Osaka, Japan. Sentimental Education by Gustave Flaubert. Chapter 18, An Auction. 12,000 francs should be procured, or, if not, he would see Madame Arnaud no more. And until now there had lingered in his breast an unconquerable hope. Did she not, as it were, constitute the very substance of his heart, the very basis of his life? For some minutes he went staggering along the footpath, his mind tortured with anxiety, and nevertheless gladdened by the thought that he was no longer by the other side. Where was he to get the money? Frederick was well aware from his own experience how hard it was to obtain it immediately, no matter at what cost. There was only one person who could help him in the matter, Madame d'Ambrose. She always kept a good supply of banknotes in her escritoire. He called at her house, and in an unblushing fashion, "Have you 12,000 francs to lend me?" "What for?" That was another person's secret. She wanted to know who this person was. He would not give way on this point. They were equally determined not to yield. Finally, she declared that she would give nothing until she knew for what purpose it was wanted. Frederick's face became very flushed, and he stated that one of his comrades had committed a theft. It was necessary to replace the sum this very day. "Let me know his name. Come, what's his name?" "Dusadier." And he threw himself on his knees, imploring of her to say nothing about it. "What idea have you got into your head about me?" Madame d'Ambrose replied. "One would imagine that you were the guilty party yourself." "Pray, have done with your tragic airs." "Hold on, here's the money, and much good may it do him." He hurried off to see Arnaud. That worthy merchant was not in his shop, but he was still residing in the Rue des Paradis, for he had 2 domiciles. In the Rue des Paradis, the porter said that Monsieur Arnaud had been away since the evening before. As for Madame, he ventured to say nothing, and Frederick, having rushed like an arrow up the stairs, laid his ear against the keyhole. At length the door was opened. Madame had gone out with Monsieur. The servant could not say when they would be back. Her wages had been paid, and she was leaving herself. Suddenly he heard the door creaking. "But is there anyone in the room?" "Oh no, monsieur, it is the wind." Thereupon he withdrew. There was something inexplicable in such a rapid disappearance. Riegenbach, being Mignot's intimate friend, could perhaps enlighten him. And Frederick got himself driven to that gentleman's house at Montmartre, in the Rue l'Empereur. Attached to the house there was a small garden shut in by a grating which was stopped up with iron plates. 3 steps before the hall door set off the white front, and a person passing along the footpath could see the 2 rooms on the ground floor, the first of which was a parlor with ladies' dresses lying on the furniture on every side, and the second, the workshop in which Madame Riegenbach's female assistants were accustomed to sit. They were all convinced that Monsieur had important occupations, distinguished connections, that he was a man altogether beyond comparison. When he was passing through the lobby with his hat cocked up at the sides, his long grave face, and his green frock coat, the girls stopped in the midst of their work. Besides, he never failed to address to them a few words of encouragement, some observation which showed his ceremonious courtesy, and afterwards, in their own homes, they felt unhappy at not having been able to preserve him as their ideal. No one, however, was so devoted to him as Madame Riegenbach, an intelligent little woman who maintained him by her handicraft. As soon as Monsieur Moreau had given his name, she came out quickly to meet him, knowing through the servants what his relations were with Madame d'Ambrose. Her husband would be back in a moment, and Frederick, while he followed her, admired the appearance of the house and the profusion of oilcloth that was displayed in it. Then he waited a few minutes in a kind of office, into which the citizen was in the habit of retiring, in order to be alone with his thoughts. When they met, Riegenbach's manner was less cranky than usual. He related Arnaud's recent history. The ex-manufacturer of earthenware had excited the vanity of Mignot, a patriot who owned 100 shares in the Cycle, by professing to show that it would be necessary from the democratic standpoint to change the management and the editorship of the newspaper, and under the pretext of making his views prevail in the next meeting of shareholders, he had given the other 50 shares, telling him that he could pass them on to reliable friends who would back up his vote. Mignot would have no personal responsibility and need not annoy himself about anyone. Then, when he had achieved success, he would be able to secure a good place in the administration of at least from 5 to 6,000 francs. The shares had been delivered, but Arnaud had at once sold them, and with the money had entered into partnership with a dealer in religious articles. Thereupon came complaints from Mignot, to which Arnaud sent evasive answers. At last, the patriot had threatened to bring against him a charge of cheating if he did not restore his share certificates or pay an equivalent sum, 50,000 francs. Frederick's face wore a look of despondency. "This is not the whole of it," said the citizen. "Mignot, who is an honest fellow, has reduced his claim to 1/4. New promises on the part of the other, and, of course, new dodges. In short, on the morning of the day before yesterday, Mignot sent him a written application to pay up, within 24 hours, 12,000 francs, without prejudice to the balance." "But I have the amount," said Frederick. The citizen slowly turned round. "Humbug." "Excuse me, I have the money in my pocket. I brought it with me." "How you do go at it! By Jove, you do. However, 'tis too late now. The complaint has been lodged, and Arnaud is gone." "Alone?" "No, along with his wife. They were seen at the Havre terminus." Frederick grew exceedingly pale. Madame Riegenbach thought he was going to faint. He regained his self-possession with an effort, and had even sufficient presence of mind to ask 2 or 3 questions about the occurrence. Riegenbach was grieved at the affair, considering that it would injure the cause of democracy. Arnaud had always been lax in his conduct and disorderly in his life. A regular harebrained fellow. He burned the candle at both ends. The petticoat has ruined him. 'Tis not himself that I pity, but his poor wife. For the citizen admired virtuous women, and had a great esteem for Madame Arnaud. She must have suffered a nice lot. Frederick felt grateful to him for his sympathy, and, as if Riegenbach had done him a service, pressed his hand effusively. "Have you done all that's necessary in the matter?" was Rosinette's greeting to him when she saw him again. He had not been able to pluck up courage to do it, he answered, and walked about the streets at random to divert his thoughts. At 8 o'clock they passed into the dining room, but they remained seated face to face in silence, gave vent each to a deep sigh every now and then, and pushed away their plates. Frederick drank some brandy. He felt quite shattered, crushed, annihilated, no longer conscious of anything save a sensation of extreme fatigue. She went to look at the portrait. The red, the yellow, the green, and the indigo made glaring stains that jarred with each other, so that it looked a hideous thing, almost ridiculous. Besides, the dead child was now unrecognizable. The purple hue of his lips made the whiteness of his skin more remarkable. His nostrils were more drawn than before, his eyes more hollow, and his head rested on a pillow of blue taffeta, surrounded by petals of camellias, autumn roses, and violets. This was an idea suggested by the chambermaid, and both of them had thus with pious care arranged the little corpse. The mantelpiece, covered with a cloth of guipure, supported silver-gilt candlesticks with bunches of consecrated box in the spaces between them. At the corners there were a pair of vases in which pastilles were burning. All these things, taken in conjunction with the cradle, presented the aspect of an altar, and Frederick recalled to mind the night when he had watched beside Madame d'Ambrouse's deathbed. Nearly every quarter of an hour, Rosinette drew aside the curtains in order to take a look at her child. She saw him in imagination, a few months hence, beginning to walk, then at college, in the middle of the recreation ground, playing a game of base, then at 20 years a full-grown young man. And all these pictures conjured up by her brain created for her, as it were, the son she would have lost, had he only lived, the excess of her grief intensifying in her the maternal instinct. Frederick, sitting motionless in another armchair, was thinking of Madame Arnaud. No doubt she was at that moment in a train, with her face leaning against a carriage window, while she watched the country disappearing behind her in the direction of Paris, or else on the deck of a steamboat, as on the occasion when they first met. But this vessel carried her away into distant countries, from which she would never return. He next saw her in a room at an inn, with trunks covering the floor, the wallpaper hanging in shreds, and the door shaking in the wind. And after that, to what would she be compelled to turn? Would she have to become a schoolmistress or a lady's companion, or perhaps a chambermaid? She was exposed to all the vicissitudes of poverty. His utter ignorance as to what her fate might be tortured his mind. He ought either to have opposed her departure or to have followed her. Was he not her real husband? And as the thought impressed himself on his consciousness that he would never meet her again, that it was all over forever, that she was lost to him beyond recall, he felt, so to speak, a rending of his entire being, and the tears that had been gathering since morning in his heart overflowed. Rosinette noticed the tears in his eyes. "Ah, you are crying just like me. You are grieving too?" "Yes, yes, I am." He pressed her to his heart, and they both sobbed, locked in each other's arms. Madame d'Ambrose was weeping too, as she lay face downwards on her bed, with her hands clasped over her head. Olympe Rickenbach, having come that evening to try on her first colored gown after mourning, had told her about Frederick's visit, and even about the 12,000 francs which he had ready to transfer to Monsieur Arnaud. So then this money, the very money which he had got from her, was intended to be used simply for the purpose of preventing the other from leaving Paris, for the purpose, in fact, of preserving a mistress. At first she broke into a violent rage, and determined to drive him from her door, as she would have driven a lackey. A copious flow of tears produced a soothing effect upon her. It was better to keep it all to herself and say nothing about it. Frederick brought her back the 12,000 francs on the following day. She begged of him to keep the money, lest he might require it for his friend, and she asked a number of questions about this gentleman. Who, then, had tempted him to such a breach of trust? A woman, no doubt. Women drag you into every kind of crime. This bantering tone put Frederick out of countenance. He felt deep remorse for the calumny he had invented. He was reassured by the reflection that Madame d'Ambrose could not be aware of the facts. All the same, she was very persistent about the subject, for 2 days later she again made inquiries about his young friend, and after that about another, des Lauriers. Is this young man trustworthy and intelligent? Frederick spoke highly of him. Ask him to call me one of these mornings. I want to consult him about a matter of business. She had found a roll of old papers in which there were some bills of Arnaud, which had been duly protested, and which had been signed by Madame Arnaud. It was about these very bills Frederick had called on Monsieur d'Ambrose on one occasion while the latter was at breakfast, and although the capitalist had not sought to enforce repayment of this outstanding debt, he had not only got judgment on foot of them from the Tribunal of Commerce against Arnaud, but also against his wife, who knew nothing about the matter, as her husband had not thought fit to give her any information on the point. Here was a weapon placed in Madame d'Ambrose's hands. She had no doubt about it. But her notary would advise her to take no step in the affair. She would have preferred to act through some obscure person, and she thought of that big fellow with such an impudent expression of face who had offered her his services. Frederick ingenuously performed this commission for her. The advocate was enchanted at the idea of having business relations with such an aristocratic lady. He hurried to Madame d'Ambrose's house. She informed him that the inheritance belonged to her niece, a further reason for liquidating those debts which she should repay, her object being to overwhelm Montignon's wife by a display of greater attention to the deceased affairs. Des Lauriers guessed that there was some hidden design underlying all this. He reflected while he was examining the bills. Madame Arnaud's name, traced by her own hand, brought once more before his eyes her entire person, and the insult which he had received at her hands. Since vengeance was offered to him, why should he not snatch at it? He accordingly advised Madame d'Ambrose to have the bad debts which went with the inheritance sold by auction. A man of straw, whose name would not be divulged, would buy them up, and would exercise the legal rights thus given him to realize them. He would take it on himself to provide a man to discharge this function. Towards the end of the month of November, Frederick, happening to pass through the street in which Madame Arnaud had lived, raised his eyes towards the windows of her house, and saw posted on the door a placard on which was printed in large letters, Sale of valuable furniture, consisting of kitchen utensils, body and table linen, shirts and chemises, lace, petticoats, trousers, French and Indian cashmeres, an Erard piano, 2 Renaissance oak chests, Venetian mirrors, Chinese and Japanese pottery. "'Tis their furniture," said Frederick to himself, and his suspicions were confirmed by the doorkeeper. As for the person who had given instructions for the sale, he could get no information on that head. But perhaps the auctioneer, Maître Berthelot, might be able to throw light on the subject. The functionary did not at first want to tell what creditor was having the sale carried out. Frederick pressed him on the point. It was a gentleman named Sentimental, an agent, and Maître Berthelot even carried his politeness so far as to lend his newspaper, the Petites Affiches, to Frederick. The latter, on reaching Rosinette's house, flung down this paper on the table, spread wide open. "Read that!" "Well, what?" said she, with a face so calm that it roused up in him a feeling of revolt. "Ah, keep up that air of innocence." "I don't understand what you mean." "'Tis you who are selling out Madame Arnaud yourself." She read over the announcement again. "Where is her name?" "Oh, 'tis her furniture. You know that as well as I do." "What does that signify to me?" said Rosinette, shrugging her shoulders. "What does it signify to you? But you are taking your revenge, that's all. This is the consequence of your persecutions. Haven't you outraged her so far as to call at her house? You, a worthless creature, and this is the most saintly, the most charming, the best woman that ever lived. Why did you set your heart on ruining her? I assure you, you are mistaken. Come now, as if you had not put Sentimental forward to do this. What nonsense!" Then he carried away with rage. You lie, you wretch! You are jealous of her. You have got the judgments against her husband. Sentimental is already mixed up in your affairs. He detests Arnaud, and your two hatreds have entered into a combination with one another. I saw how delighted he was when you won that action of yours about the Cowlin shares. Are you going to deny this?" "I give you my Oh, I know what that's worth, your word." And Frederick reminded her of her lovers, giving their names and circumstantial details. Rosinette drew back, all of the color fading from her face. "You are astonished at this. You thought I was blind because I shut my eyes. Now I have had enough of it. We do not die through the treacheries of a woman of your sort. When they become too monstrous, we get out of the way. To inflict punishment on account of them would be only to degrade oneself." She twisted her arms about. "My God, who can it be that has changed him?" "Nobody but yourself." "And all this for Madame Arnaud!" exclaimed Rosinette, weeping. He replied coldly, "I have never loved any woman but her." At this insult, her tears ceased to flow. "That shows your good taste. A woman of mature years, with a complexion like licorice, a thick waist, big eyes like the vantaux of a cellar, and just as empty. As you like her so much, go and join her." "This is just what I expected. Thank you." Rosinette remained motionless, stupefied by this extraordinary behavior. She even allowed the door to be shut. Then, with a bound, she pulled him back into the ante-room, and flinging her arms around him. "Why, you are mad! You are mad! This is absurd! I love you!" Then she changed her tone to one of entreaty. "Good heavens! For the sake of our dead infant!" "Confess that it was you who did this trick," said Frederick. She still protested that she was innocent. "You will not acknowledge it?" "No." "Well then, farewell and forever." "Listen to me." Frederick turned round. "If you understood me better, you would know that my decision is irrevocable." Oh, you will come back to me again." "Never, as long as I live." And he slammed the door behind him violently. Rosinette wrote to Deslauriers, saying that she wanted to see him at once. He called one evening, about 5 days later, and, when she told him about the rupture, "That's all. A nice piece of bad luck." She thought at first that he would have been able to bring back Frederick, but now all was lost. She ascertained through the doorkeeper that he was about to be married to Madame d'Ambrose. Deslauriers gave her a lecture and showed himself an exceedingly gay fellow, quite a jolly dog, and, as it was very late, asked permission to pass the night in an armchair. Then, next morning, he set out again for Nogent, informing her that he was unable to say when they would meet once more. In a little while, there would perhaps be a great change in his life. 2 hours after his return, the town was in a state of revolution. The news went round that Monsieur Frederick was going to marry Madame d'Ambrose. At length, the three Mademoiselles Auguer, unable to stand it any longer, made their way to the house of Madame Moreau, who, with an air of pride, confirmed this intelligence. Peyerroc became quite ill when he heard it. Louise locked herself up. It was even rumored that she had gone mad. Meanwhile, Frederick was unable to hide his dejection. Madame d'Ambrose, in order to divert his mind, no doubt, from gloomy thoughts, redoubled her attentions. Every afternoon they went out for a drive in her carriage, and, on one occasion, as they were passing along the Place de la Bourse, she took the idea into her head to pay a visit to the public auction rooms for the sake of amusement. It was the 1st of December, the very day on which the sale of Madame Arnaud's furniture was to take place. He remembered the date and manifested his repugnance, declaring that this place was intolerable on account of the crush and the noise. She only wanted to get a peep at it. The brougham drew up. He had no alternative but to accompany her. In the open space could be seen wash-hand stands without basins, the wooden portions of armchairs, old hampers, pieces of porcelain, empty bottles, mattresses, and men in blouses or in dirty frock coats, all grey with dust, and mean-looking faces. Some with canvas sacks over their shoulders were chatting in separate groups or hailing each other in a disorderly fashion. Frederick urged that it was inconvenient to go any further. "Pooh!" And they ascended the stairs. In the first room at the right, gentlemen with catalogues in their hands were examining pictures. In another, a collection of Chinese weapons were being sold. Madame d'Ambrose wanted to go down again. She looked at the numbers over the doors, and she led him to the end of the corridor towards an apartment which was blocked up with people. He immediately recognized the two whatnots belonging to the office of l'Arts Industriel, her work table, all her furniture. Heaped up at the end of the room according to their respective heights, they formed a long slope from the floor to the windows, and at the other sides of the apartment, the carpets and the curtains hung down straight along the walls. There were underneath steps occupied by old men who had fallen asleep. At the left rose a sort of counter, at which the auctioneer, in a white cravat, was slightly swinging a little hammer. By his side a young man was writing, and below him stood a sturdy fellow, between a commercial traveler and a vendor of countermarks, crying out, "Furniture for sale!" 3 attendants placed the articles on a table, at the sides of which sat in a row second-hand dealers and old-clothes women. The general public at the auction kept walking in a circle behind them. When Frederick came in, the petticoats, the neckerchiefs, and even the chemises were being passed on from hand to hand and then given back. Sometimes they were flung some distance, and suddenly strips of whiteness went flying through the air. After that her gowns were sold, and then one of her hats, the broken feather of which was hanging down, then her furs, and then 3 pairs of boots. And the disposal by sale of these relics, wherein he could trace in a confused sort of way the very outlines of her form, appeared to him an atrocity, as if he had seen carrion crows mangling her corpse. The atmosphere of the room, heavy with so many breaths, made him feel sick. Madame d'Ambrose offered him her smelling bottle. She said that she found all this highly amusing. The bedroom furniture was now exhibited. Maître Berthemont named a price. The crier immediately repeated it in a louder voice, and the 3 auctioneers' assistants quietly waited for the stroke of the hammer, and then carried off the articles sold to an adjoining apartment. In this way disappeared, one after the other, the large blue carpet spangled with camellias, which her dainty feet used to touch so lightly as she advanced to meet him, the little upholstered easy-chair, in which he used to sit facing her when they were alone together, the 2 screens belonging to the mantelpiece, the ivory of which had been rendered smoother by the touch of her hands, and a velvet pincushion, which was still bristling with pins. It was as if portions of his heart had been carried away with these things, and the monotony of the same voices and the same gestures benumbed him with fatigue, and caused within him a mournful torpor, a sensation like that of death itself. There was a rustle of silk close to his ear. Rosinette touched him. It was through Frederick himself that she had learned about this auction. When her first feelings of vexation was over, the idea of deriving profit from it occurred to her mind. She had come to see it in a white satin vest with pearl buttons, a fur-bellowed gown, tight-fitting gloves on her hands, and a look of triumph on her face. He grew pale with anger. She stared at the woman who was by his side. Madame d'Ambrose had recognized her, and for a minute they examined each other from head to foot minutely, in order to discover the defect, the blemish, the one perhaps envying the other's youth, and the other filled with spite at the extreme good form, the aristocratic simplicity of her rival. At last, Madame d'Ambrose turned her head round with a smile of inexpressible insolence. The crier had opened a piano, her piano. While he remained standing before it, he ran the fingers of his right hand over the keys and put the instrument at 1,200 francs. Then he brought down the figures to 1,000, then to 800, and finally to 700. Madame d'Ambrose, in a playful tone, laughed at the appearance of some socket that was out of gear. The next thing placed before the second-hand dealers was a little chest with medallions and silver corners and clasps, the same one which he had seen at the first dinner in the Rue des Choiseaux, which had subsequently been in Rosinette's house, and again transferred back to Madame Arnaud's residence. Often, during their conversations, his eyes wandered towards it. He was bound to it by the dearest memories, and his soul was melting with tender emotions about it, when suddenly Madame d'Ambrose said, "Look here, I am going to buy that." "But it is not a very rare article," he returned. She considered it, on the contrary, very pretty, and the appraiser commended its delicacy. "A gem of the Renaissance. 800 francs, messieurs, almost entirely of silver. With a little whiting it can be made to shine brilliantly." And, as she was pushing forward through the crush of people, "What an odd idea," said Frederick. "You are annoyed at this." "No, but what can be done with a fancy article of that sort?" "Who knows? Love letters might be kept in it, perhaps." She gave him a look which made the illusion very clear. "A reason the more for not robbing the dead of their secrets. I did not imagine she was dead." And then in a loud voice she went on to bid, 880 francs. "What you are doing is not right," murmured Frederick. She began to laugh. "But this is the first favor, dear, that I am asking from you." "Come now, doesn't it strike you that at this rate you won't be a very considerate husband?" Someone had just at that moment made a higher bid. 900 francs. 900 francs, repeated Maître Berthelot. 910, 15, 20, 30, squeaked the auctioneer's crier, with jerky shakes of his head as he cast a sweeping glance at those assembled around him. "Show me that I am going to have a wife who is amenable to reason," said Frederick. And he gently drew her towards the door. The auctioneer proceeded. Come, messieurs, 930. Is there any bidder at 930? Madame d'Ambrose, just as she had reached the door, stopped, and raising her voice to a high pitch, 1,000 francs. There was a thrill of astonishment, and then a dead silence. 1,000 francs, messieurs, 1,000 francs. Is nobody advancing on this bid? Is that clear? Very well, then. 1,000 francs. Going, gone. And down came the ivory hammer. She passed in her card, and the little chest was handed over to her. She thrust it into her muff. Frederick felt a great chill penetrating his heart. Madame d'Ambrose had not let go of her hold of his arm, and she had not the courage to look up at his face in the street where her carriage was awaiting her. She flung herself into it, like a thief flying away after a robbery, and then turned towards Frederick. He had his hat in his hand. "Are you not going to come in?" "No, madame." And bowing to her frigidly, he shut the carriage door, and then made a sign to the coachman to drive away. The first feeling that he experienced was one of joy at having regained his independence. he was filled with pride at the thought that he had avenged Madame Arnaud by sacrificing a fortune to her. Then he was amazed at his own act, and he felt doubled up with extreme physical exhaustion. Next morning, his manservant brought him the news. The city had been declared to be in a state of siege. The assembly had been dissolved, and a number of the representatives of the people had been imprisoned at Mazas. Public affairs had assumed to his mind an utterly unimportant aspect, so deeply preoccupied was he by his private troubles. He wrote to several tradesmen, countermanding various orders which he had given for the purchase of articles in connection with his projected marriage, which now appeared to him in the light of a rather mean speculation. And he execrated Madame d'Ambrose, because, owing to her, he had been very near perpetrating a vile action. He had forgotten the Marechal, and did not even bother himself about Madame Arnaud, absorbed only in one thought. Lost amid the wreck of his dreams, sick at heart, full of grief and disappointment, and, in his hatred of the artificial atmosphere wherein he had suffered so much, he longed for the freshness of green fields, the repose of provincial life, a sleeping existence spent beneath his natal roof in the midst of ingenuous hearts. At last, when Wednesday evening arrived, he made his way out into the open air. On the boulevard, numerous groups had taken up their stand. From time to time, a patrol came and dispersed them. They gathered together again in regular order behind it. They talked freely and in loud tones, made chaffing remarks about the soldiers without anything further happening. "What, are they not going to fight?" said Frederick to a workman. "They're not such fools as to get themselves killed for the well-off people. Let them take care of themselves." And a gentleman muttered, as he glanced across at the inhabitants of the faubourgs, "Socialist rascals, if it were only possible this time to exterminate them." Frederick could not, for the life of him, understand the necessity of so much rancor and vituperative language. His feeling of disgust against Paris was intensified by these occurrences, and 2 days later he set out for Nogent by the first train. The houses soon became lost to view. The country stretched out before his gaze. Alone in his carriage, with his feet on the seat in front of him, he pondered over the events of the last few days, and then on his entire past. The recollection of Louise came back to his mind. She, indeed, loved me truly. I was wrong not to snatch at this chance of happiness. Pooh, let us not think any more about it. Then 5 minutes afterwards, who knows, after all, why not later? His reverie, like his eyes, wandered afar through vague horizons. She was artless, a peasant girl, almost a savage, but so good. In proportion as he drew nearer to Nogent, her image drew closer to him. As they were passing through the meadows of Sourdon, he saw her once more in imagination under the poplar trees, as in the old days, cutting rushes on the edges of the pools. And now they had reached their destination. He stepped out of the train. Then he leaned with his elbows on the bridge to gaze again at the aisle and the garden where they had walked together one sunshiny day, and the dizzy sensation caused by traveling, together with the weakness engendered by his recent emotions, arousing in his breast a sort of exaltation, he said to himself, "She has gone out, perhaps. Suppose I were to go and meet her?" The bell of Saint Laurent was ringing, and in the square in front of the church there was a crowd of poor people around an open carriage, the only one in the district, the one which was always hired for weddings. And all of a sudden, under the church gate, accompanied by a number of well-dressed persons in white cravats, a newly married couple appeared. He thought he must be laboring under some hallucination. But no, it was, indeed, Louise, covered with a white veil which flowed from her red hair down to her heels, and with her was no other than Deslauriers, attired in a blue coat embroidered with silver, the costume of a prefect. How was this? Frederick concealed himself at the corner of a house to let the procession pass. Shamefaced, vanquished, crushed, he retraced his steps to the railway station and returned to Paris. The cabman who drove him assured him that the barricades were erected from the Château d'Eu to the Gymnase, and turned down the Faubourg Saint-Martin. At the corner of the Rue de Provence, Frederick stepped out in order to reach the boulevards. It was 5 o'clock. A thin shower was falling. A number of citizens blocked up the footpath close to the opera house. The houses opposite were closed. No one at any of the windows. All along the boulevard, dragoons were galloping behind a row of wagons, leaning with drawn swords over their horses, and the plumes of their helmets and their large white cloaks rising up behind them could be seen under the glare of the gas lamps, which shook the wind in the mist of a haze. The crowd gazed at them mute with fear. In the intervals between the cavalry charges, squads of policemen arrived on the scene to keep back the people in the streets. But on the steps of Tortoni, a man, Dusadier, who could be distinguished at a distance by his great height, remained standing as motionless as a caryatid. One of the police officers, marching at the head of his men, with his three-cornered hat drawn over his eyes, threatened him with his sword. The other thereupon took one step forward and shouted, "Long live the Republic!" The next moment he fell on his back with his arms crossed. A yell of horror arose from the crowd. The police officer, with a look of command, made a circle around him, and Frederick, gazing at him in open-mouthed astonishment, recognized Senecal. End of chapter 18.
Chapter number 19 of Sentimental Education. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Sentimental Education by Gustave Flaubert. Chapter 19. A Bittersweet Reunion. He traveled. He realized the melancholy associated with packet boats, the chill one feels on waking up under tents, the dizzy effect of landscapes in ruins, and the bitterness of ruptured sympathies. He returned home. He mingled in society, and he conceived attachments to other women. But the constant recollection of his first love made these appear insipid, and besides the vehemence of desire, the bloom of the sensation had vanished. In like manner, his intellectual ambitions had grown weaker. Years passed, and he was forced to support the burthen of a life in which his mind was unoccupied and his heart devoid of energy. Toward the end of March, 1867, just as it was getting dark, one evening he was sitting all alone in his study when a woman suddenly came in. "Madame Arnoux!" "Frederick!" She caught hold of his hands and drew him gently towards the window, and as she gazed into his face, she kept repeating, "'Tis he! Yes, indeed, 'tis he!" In the growing shadows of the twilight, he could only see her eyes under the black lace veil that hid her face. When she had laid down on the edge of the mantelpiece a little pocket-book bound in garnet velvet, she seated herself in front of him, and they both remained silent, unable to utter a word, smiling at one another. At last he asked her a number of questions about herself and her husband. They had gone to live in a remote part of Brittany for the sake of economy, so as to be able to pay their debts. Arnoux, who was now almost a chronic invalid, seemed to have become quite an old man. Her daughter had been married and was living at Bordeaux, and her son was in garrison at Mostaganem. Then she raised her head to look at him again. "But I see you once more. I am happy." He did not fail to let her know that, as soon as he heard of their misfortune, he had hastened to their house. "I was fully aware of it." "How?" She had seen him in the street outside the house and had hidden herself. "Why did you do that?" Then, in a trembling voice and with long pauses between her words, I was afraid. Yes, afraid of you and of myself." This disclosure gave him, as it were, a shock of voluptuous joy. His heart began to throb wildly. She went on, "Excuse me for not having come sooner," and pointing towards the little pocket-book covered with golden palm branches. "I embroidered it on your account expressly. It contains the amount for which the Belleville property was given as security." Frederick thanked her for letting him have the money, while chiding her at the same time for having given herself any trouble about it. "No, 'tis not for this I came. I was determined to pay you this visit, then I would go back there again." And she spoke about the place where they had taken up their abode. It was a low-built house of only one story, and there was a garden attached to it, full of huge box trees, and a double avenue of chestnut trees, reaching up to the top of the hill, from which there was a view of the sea. I go there and sit down on a bench which I have called Frederick's bench. Then she proceeded to fix her gaze on the furniture, the objects of virtue, the pictures with eager intentness so that she might be able to carry away the impressions of them in her memory. The Maréchal's portrait was half hidden behind a curtain, but the gilding and the white space of the picture, which showed their outlines through the midst of the surrounding darkness, attracted her attention. "It seems to me I knew the woman?" "Impossible," said Frederick. "It is an old Italian painting." She confessed that she would like to take a walk through the streets on his arm. They went out. The light from the shop windows fell, every now and then, on her pale profile. Then once more she was wrapped in shadow, and in the midst of the carriages, the crowd, and the din, they walked on without paying any heed to what was happening around them, without hearing anything, like those who make their way across the fields over beds of dead leaves. They talked about the days which they had formerly spent in each other's society, the dinners at the time when l'ordre industriel flourished, Arnoux' fads, his habit of drawing up the ends of his collar and of squeezing cosmetic over his mustache, and other matters of more intimate and serious character. What delight he experienced on the first occasion when he heard her singing! How lovely she looked on her feast day at St. Cloud! He recalled to her memory the little garden at Auteuil, evenings at the theatre, a chance meeting on the boulevard, and some of her old servants, including the negress. She was astonished at his vivid recollection of these things. "Sometimes your words come back to me like a distant echo, like the sound of a bell carried on by the wind, and when I read the passages about love in books, it seems to me that it is about you I am reading. All that people have found with as exaggerated in fiction you have made me feel," said Frederick. "I can understand Werther, who felt no disgust at his Charlotte for eating bread and butter." Poor dear friend! She heaved a sigh, and after a prolonged silence, "No matter, we shall have loved each other truly." "And still without having ever belonged to each other?" "This perhaps is all the better," she replied. "No, no, what happiness we might have enjoyed!" "Oh, I am sure of it with a love like yours." And it must have been very strong to endure after such a long separation. Frederick wished to know from her how she first discovered that he loved her. "It was when you kissed my wrist one evening between the glove and the cuff. I said to myself, 'Ah, yes, he loves me, he loves me.' Nevertheless, I was afraid of being assured of it. So charming was your reserve that I felt myself the object, as it were, of an involuntary and continuous homage." He regretted nothing now. He was compensated for all he had suffered in the past. When they came back to the house, Madame Arnoux took off her bonnet. The lamp placed on a bracket threw its light on her white hair. Frederick felt as if someone had given him a blow in the middle of the chest. In order to conceal from her his sense of disillusion, he flung himself on the floor at her feet, and seizing her hands, began to whisper in her ears words of tenderness. "Your person, your slightest movement seemed to me to have more than human importance in the world. My heart was like dust under your feet. You produced on me the effect of moonlight on a summer's night, when around us we found nothing but perfumes, soft shadows, gleams of whiteness, infinity, and all the delights of the flesh and of the spirit were for me embodied in your name, which I kept repeating to myself while I tried to kiss it with my lips. I thought of nothing further. It was Madame Arnoux such as you were with your 2 children, tender, grave, dazzlingly beautiful, and yet so good. This image effaced every other. Did I not think of it alone? For I had always in the very depths of my soul the music of your voice and the brightness of your eyes." She accepted with transports of joy these tributes of adoration to the woman whom she could no longer claim to be. Frederick, becoming intoxicated with his own words, came to believe himself in the reality of what he said. Madame Arnoux, with her back turned to the light of the lamp, stooped towards him. He felt the caress of her breath on his forehead, and the undefined touch of her entire body through the garments that kept them apart. Their hands were clasped. The tip of her boot peeped out from beneath her gown, and he said to her, as if ready to faint, "The sight of your foot makes me lose my self-possession." An impulse of modesty made her rise. Then, without any further movement, she said with the strange intonation of a somnambulist, "At my age, Frederick, no woman has ever been loved as I have been. No, where is the use in being young? What do I care about them, indeed? I despise them, all those women who come here." "Oh, very few women come to this place," he returned in a complacent fashion. Her face brightened up, and then she asked him whether he meant to be married. He swore that he never would. "Are you perfectly sure? Why should you not?" "'Tis on your account," said Frederick, clasping her in her arms. She remained thus pressed to his heart, with her head thrown back, her lips parted, and her eyes raised. Suddenly she pushed him away from her with a look of despair, and when he implored of her to say something to him in reply, she bent forward and whispered, "I would have liked to make you happy." Frederick had a suspicion that Madame Mornu had come to offer herself to him, and once more he was seized with a desire to possess her, stronger, fiercer, more desperate than he had ever experienced before. And yet, he felt, the next moment, an unaccountable repugnance to the thought of such a thing, and as it were a dread of incurring the guilt of incest. Another fear, too, had a different effect on him, lest disgust might afterwards take possession of him. Besides, how embarrassing it would be, and abandoning the idea partly through prudence and partly through a resolve not to degrade his ideal, he turned on his heel and proceeded to roll a cigarette between his fingers. She watched him with admiration. "How dainty you are! There is no one like you! There is no one like you!" It struck 11. "Already?" she exclaimed. "At 1:15 I must go." She sat down again, but she kept looking at the clock, and he walked up and down the room, puffing at his cigarette. Neither of them could think of anything further to say to other. There is a moment at the hour of parting when the person that we love is with us no longer. At last, when the hands of the clock got past the 25 minutes, she slowly took up her bonnet, holding it by the strings. "Goodbye, my friend, my dear friend. I shall never see you again. This is the closing page in my life as a woman. My soul shall remain with you even when you see me no more. May all the blessings of heaven be yours." And she kissed him on the forehead like a mother. But she appeared to be looking for something, and then she asked him for a pair of scissors. She unfastened her comb, and all her white hair fell down. With an abrupt movement of the scissors, she cut off a long lock from the roots. "Keep it. Goodbye." When she was gone, Frederick rushed to the window and threw it open. There on the footpath he saw Madame Arnoux beckoning towards the passing cab. She stepped into it. The vehicle disappeared. And this was all. End of chapter number 19.
Chapter 20 of Sentimental Education. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Sentimental Education by Gustave Flaubert. Chapter 20. Wait till you come to 40 year. About the beginning of this winter, Frédéric and Delaurier were chatting by the fireside, once more reconciled by the fatality of their nature, which made them always reunite and be friends again. Frédéric briefly explained his quarrel with Madame d'Ambreuse, who had married again, her second husband being an Englishman. Delaurier, without telling how he had come to marry Mademoiselle Roch, related to his friend how his wife had one day eloped with a singer. In order to wipe away to some extent the ridicule that this brought upon him, he had compromised himself by an excess of governmental zeal in the exercise of his functions as prefect. He had been dismissed. After that he had been an agent for colonization in Algeria, secretary to a pasha, editor of a newspaper, and canvasser for advertisements, his latest employment being the office of settling disputed cases for a manufacturing company. As for Frédéric, having squandered 2/3 of his means, he was now living like a citizen of comparatively humble rank. Then they questioned each other about their friends. Martineau was now a member of the Senate. Hussonnet occupied a high position, in which he was fortunate enough to have all the theatres and entire press dependent upon him. Sisy, given up to religion, and the father of 8 children, was living in the chateau of his ancestors. Pellerin, after turning his hand to Fourierism, homeopathy, table-turning, Gothic art, and humanitarian painting, had become a photographer. He was now to be seen on every dead wall in Paris, where he was represented in a black coat with a very small body and a big head. "And what about your chum Sénécal?" asked Frédéric. "Disappeared. I can't tell you where. And yourself, what about the woman you were so passionately attached to, Madame Arnoux?" "She is probably at Rome with her son, a lieutenant of chasseurs." "And her husband?" "He died a year ago." "You don't say so!" exclaimed the advocate. Then, striking his forehead, "Now that I think of it, the other day in a shop I met that worthy Maréchal, holding by the hand a little boy whom she has adopted. She is the widow of a certain Monsieur Audry, and is now enormously stout. What a change for the worse, she who formerly had such a slender waist." Delaurier did not deny that he had taken advantage of the other's despair to assure himself of that fact by personal experience. "As you gave me permission, however—" This avowal was a compensation for the silence he had maintained with reference to his attempt with Madame Arnoux. Frédéric would have forgiven him, inasmuch as he had not succeeded in the attempt. Although a little annoyed at the discovery, he pretended to laugh at it, and the allusion to the Maréchal brought back the Vatnas to his recollection. Delaurier had never seen her any more than the others who used to come to the Arnoux' house, but he remembered Rochembard perfectly. "Is he still living?" "He is barely alive. Every evening regularly he drags himself from the Rue de Grammont to the Rue Montmartre, to the cafés, enfeebled, bent in two, emaciated, a spectre." "Well, what about Campin?" Frédéric uttered a cry of joy, and begged of the ex-delegate of the provisional government to explain to him the mystery of the calf's head. "'Tis an English importation. In order to parody the ceremony which the Royalists celebrated on the 30th of January, some independents founded an annual banquet, at which they have been accustomed to eat calves' heads, and at which they make it their business to drink red wine out of calves' skulls, while giving toasts in favor of the extermination of the Stuarts. After Thermidor, the terrorists organized a brotherhood of a similar description, which proves how prolific folly is." "You seem to me very dispassionate about politics." "Effect of age," said the advocate. And then they each proceeded to summarize their lives. They had both failed in their objects, the one who dreamed only of love, and the other of power. What was the reason of this? "'Tis perhaps from not having taken up the proper line," said Frédéric. "In your case that may be so. I, on the contrary, have sinned through excess of rectitude, without taking into account 1,000 secondary things more important than any. I had too much logic, and you too much sentiment." Then they blamed luck, circumstances, the epoch at which they were born. Frédéric went on. "We have never done what we thought of doing long ago at Sens, when you wished to write a critical history of philosophy, and I a great medieval romance about Nogent, the subject of which I had found in Froissart, how Messire Brocard de Fenestrange and the Archbishop of Troyes attacked Messire Eustache d'Ambrecicourt. Do you remember?" And exhuming their youth with every sentence, they said to each other, "Do you remember?" They saw once more the college playground, the chapel, the parlor, the fencing school at the bottom of the staircase, the faces of the ushers and of the pupils, one named Angelmar from Versailles, who used to cut off trouser straps from old boots, Monsieur Merbal and his red whiskers, the 2 professors of linear drawing and large drawing who were always wrangling, and the Pole, the fellow countryman of Copernicus, with his planetary system on pasteboard, an itinerant astronomer whose lecture had been paid for by a dinner in the refectory. Then a terrible debauch while they were out on a walking excursion, the first pipes they had smoked, the distribution of prizes, and the delightful sensation of going home for the holidays. It was during the vacation of 1837 that they had called at the house of the Turkish woman. This was the phrase used to designate a woman whose real name was Zoraïde Turk, and many persons believed her to be a Mohammedan, a Turk, which added to the poetic character of her establishment, situated at the water's edge behind the rampart. Even in the middle of summer there was a shadow around her house, which could be recognized by a glass bowl of goldfish near a pot of mignonette at a window. Young ladies in white night-dresses with painted cheeks and long earrings used to tap at the panes as the students passed, and as it grew dark, their custom was to hum softly in their hoarse voices at the doorsteps. This home of perdition spread its fantastic notoriety over all the arrondissement. Allusions were made to it in a circumlocutory style. The place you know, a certain street, at the bottom of the bridges. It made the farmers' wives of the district tremble for their husbands, and the ladies grow apprehensive as to their servants' virtue, inasmuch as the sub-prefect's cook had been caught there. And to be sure, it exercised a fascination over the minds of all the young lads of the place. Now one Sunday during vesper time, Frédéric and Delaurier, having previously curled their hair, gathered some flowers in Madame Moreau's garden, then made their way out through the gate leading into the fields, and after taking a wide sweep round the vineyards, came back through the fishery, and stole into the Turkish woman's house with their big bouquets still in their hands. Frédéric presented his as a lover does to his betrothed. But the great heat, the fear of the unknown, and even the very pleasure of seeing at one glance so many women placed at his disposal, excited him so strangely that he turned exceedingly pale, and remained there without advancing a single step or uttering a single word. All the girls burst out laughing, amused at his embarrassment. Fancying that they were turning him into ridicule, he ran away, and as Frederick had the money, Delaurier was obliged to follow him. They were seen leaving the house, and the episode furnished material for a bit of local gossip which was not forgotten 3 years later. They related the story to each other in a prolix fashion, each supplementing the narrative where the other's memory failed. And when they had finished the recital, "That was the best time we ever had," said Frédéric. "Yes, perhaps so indeed. It was the best time we ever had," said Delaurier. End of chapter 20. End of Sentimental Education by Gustave Flaubert.